when people hear what they don't want to hear. We've talked
Right.
about this in a previous episode about, the words becoming violence. Essentially, it's thrown back of, well, that's hateful because that's not what I want to hear. Welcome to Awake at the Wheel. In this episode, we're going to be discussing issues relating to gender. Specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the research that's relevant to this topic. Additionally, we're going to be looking at some of the politics surrounding this topic, in addition to some of the emerging social trends. So, to begin with, I think that we should really preface why it is that we're discussing this topic. And I certainly can't speak for both of us, but I'll say from my perspective, as a clinician, many of these issues directly will impact us and have been impacting us and the way in which we conduct ourselves in our profession. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, as a parent, the messages and the messaging that is being presented to children starting in preschool in many cases is of utmost importance for parents to understand what to do with all of it. And thirdly, as a general citizen of society, with a lot of the changes that we're seeing, I believe it's incredibly important for us to stay as well versed on both sides of the discussion as much as possible. So, Oren, why is this a topic that's important to you?
Well, I've been teaching psychology of human sexuality and gender for over 20 years, about 100 times in several different universities. And I've watched the information with respect to these phenomena develop, whether it's in a textbook, whether it's among colleagues, whether it's what students are coming with, as far as the information they've heard. And I've just seen far too much misinformation. I've seen too much ideology replacing science. I've been seeing too much, let's say, self serving claims replacing best practices. And I've spoken to so many people, whether it's people with gender related issues themselves or their family members who have just been, let's say, floored by the kind of information that they're seeing, but more importantly, the kinds of distress, confusion, let's say discomfort that they're hearing younger people talking about when it comes to their own bodies, their own sense of gender, their own identity, their own sexuality. And all of these things are interrelated. Anyone who claims that they're all separate constructs that have nothing to do with each other is denying reality. So, and I've been fighting, like for let's say, for proper understanding, for a more comprehensive, fair, and balanced approach to dealing with all of this since about 2016. That's when it became really public because Dr. Jordan Peterson, in September-ish, October of 2016, made a couple of videos that became infamous, in which he was saying that I am not going to allow the Canadian government to dictate what I must say, not what I'm allowed to say, but what I must say. And he was talking about preferred pronouns. And he made a few claims. And I have to say that in the early days, I mean, really, if you ask anybody, it was around 2016 that people said, I started to see this become more of an issue. Everything started to explode around then. Technically, it was around 2011, but it was 2016 with Dr. Peterson's videos that it really exploded. And in his first couple of videos and subsequent interviews and talks that he was giving, he was not as, let's say, nuanced and careful and tactful in how he explained his position and the evidence he was providing. So people heard what sounded like transphobic or anti-trans rhetoric, and that wasn't the case. He was just speaking very bluntly and assuming that people would be able to understand what he was saying. And he gave maybe the general audience too much credit. Over the years, he's become more refined. He's become more careful in how he's presented the information, but the information hasn't really changed. The only thing that's changed is there is more misinformation. There are more radical claims. And most importantly, far more young people are expressing confusion, distress, chaos around their own bodies and their own sense of being. And unfortunately, many of them are headed in a really terrible direction, which we'll talk about today. And that's the main thing, is the impact. If it was just a philosophy, if it was just something people talked about, that would be one thing. But the real life impact it's having on the people themselves and the people around them and society in general,
Hmm.
it's no one would have predicted this 10 years ago.
No,
So
no,
that's where I'm coming from,
absolutely.
trying to help.
So, what I will add here as well is that Oren and I are going to make a very concerted effort to ensure that we're focusing on the science, on the research, and not insert our own personal opinions, biases, and beliefs. Now, we're humans, so that may creep in because that's natural, but everything that we discuss, we're going to include links to in the description of our YouTube video and on our website as well for those who are listening to this as an audio podcast. So, I want to start with that. And Oren, you discussed, where it came from in terms of, the current, I suppose, questioning and exploration of why are people doing this. But in preparation for this podcast today, I was actually looking for where did this start? And what I mean by this is the notion and the idea that gender is socially constructed. Because if we go back centuries, there isn't a ton of evidence that is, in the direction of people viewing gender in this way. And let me add as well, this isn't to say that I'll speak for myself, that I don't think that, gender dysphoria and um, transgender individuals aren't a real thing. But what I'm specifically referring to is this social phenomenon that we're seeing. And we'll get into this topic more, but the rapid onset of gender dysphoria. So, in my search for where did this all come from, I came across a study which is formerly known as the Joan study from the 60s. So, this involves Dr. John Money as well as the Reamer family. So, I'll give a very brief overview of what this was about. But the Reamer family in Winnipeg, in Canada, had twins. And with these twins, when they were infants, there were some issues that came about, I believe, with their urinary tract. And that then subsequently resulted in them becoming circumcised at the age of 8 months. Unfortunately, disastrously, it went terribly wrong with the brother Bruce. And a horrific accident took place, which instead of circumcising him in the proper manner, it ended in him losing his penis altogether. So obviously, this family was despondent, distressed, didn't know what to do with this. They took their baby home, and they did what they did over the next few months. It's my understanding that they came across something on television with Dr. John Money, where he began discussing the fact that children can be raised in a manner that is socially constructed with respect to their gender. So long story short, they ended up connecting with Dr. John Money in the US, and they did surgery to remove the genitals, remove the testicles, and socially transition Bruce to Brenda and raise Brenda as a female. And one of the caveats of this from Dr. John Money's advice was you cannot tell Brenda that she was born as a male because that will ruin everything. That will ruin what we're trying to do here. So, Dr. John Money published a study following these twins over the years, and in his study, referring to Brenda as Joan, and claiming that Joan lived a happy, healthy, fine life as a female. Um, Later on, it was found out that this was patently false. When Brenda became a teenager, um, had a moment of crystallization where she knew that she was indeed a male. And I'm leaving out many of the details, and again, we'll link this study to the description. But essentially, Brenda transitioned back to living as a male and referred to himself as David and lived his life as David. And there was a tragic end to this story because, understandably, there was a lot of trauma and psychological distress that came along with this. But in so doing this, Dr. John Money was able to propagate the fact that gender is socially constructed. That was kind of the moral of the story here. So, Oren, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, only that when you look at the history and what Dr. Money did with the boys, or boy and girl, there were some concerning, let's say, behaviors in Dr. Money. He had them, engage in sex play with each other. There was some question about what his motives were, what the rationale behind some behaviors was, and as you say, this has been this. He so falsely portrayed the adjustment of Bruce, Brenda, David, which was just patently false, as you say. And so, yeah, that's all I'm going to add. That it was a tragedy, and we, again, you'll link the story. I've talked about this with Dr. Alice Drager as well on my own podcast years ago, and I've taught about it. And the thing is that people who are too extreme, let's say on the anti-trans side, they will take Dr. Money and Dr. Alfred Kinsey, and they will portray them in the most negative light. Now, there's a lot of criticism that is warranted. I just don't want people to go too far and, let's say, make claims that can't be verified. So let's say that what Dr. Money did, what Dr. Kinsey did, the reality behind it was concerning enough. Because what they say is these two perverts, they are the ones who, had this maniacal plan to, change our sense of gender and to make us all these freaks and so on. That's just hyperbole, and hyperbole doesn't serve anybody. So I hope people will look at the story and realize that the truth is bad enough. We don't need to inflate it with fiction.
Absolutely. So nowadays, we're seeing a lot of, as I mentioned the term before, rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I think that it would be prudent for us to first distinguish between, what clinically diagnosed gender dysphoria as per the DSM-5 TR looks like versus rapid onset, because rapid onset is not currently in the DSM. It's not a diagnosable condition, but it is the name that is being used for the social phenomenon that we're seeing. So what would you like to say as far as the rapid onset?
Well, we're going to talk about it because that I would argue that the rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD, that Dr. Lisa Littman originally coined a few years ago, I think it's 2017. And if I'm ever off by a year, that's just I apologize for the dates, but I'm pretty sure it's 2017. That again, when I talked about extreme views, people are trying to totally discredit it. They're saying they're right. It's not yet a disorder. It hasn't been recognized by the DSM yet, and it may never be because for political reasons, political only, because the phenomenon or phenomena that she was describing was something that so many clinicians, parents, educators saw themselves. And the point is that, and before I go further, there are several different types of etiologies and presentations of gender dysphoria, and to treat them all the same, to say, no, 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 we don't want to understand that somebody can show these signs early on or later. And the related phenomena that they are so different that they're almost completely like that you can create taxonomies in which they're different groupings. All right. And we'll talk about that as well, that people want to deny that. And so that they're trying to dismiss rapid onset gender dysphoria because they don't like the implications. And the implications are that many of these young people, let's say going through puberty, post puberty, mostly young girls, teenagers, that they suddenly out of nowhere. Now, some will argue, no, they were just repressing it all these years, or they didn't want to just upset their family. They didn't want to be rejected. So they're really hiding it. Okay. And we'll go into that. But the point is that these people suddenly, after never showing any dysphoria, distress, confusion about their gender, and usually didn't show any cross gender behavior. So these girls were not acting like boys. Now, many of them may be tomboys. Being a tomboy does not mean transgender necessarily. So the most that you could say is that maybe they were a little bit on the masculine side or on the, again, tomboyish side. But that's it. And it was never an issue for them. They just like to play sports. Maybe they like jeans instead of dresses. But again, they never showed any concerns about that per se. And then suddenly, as teenagers, again, through puberty or post puberty, they suddenly started saying, I am transgender. I want to bind my breasts. I want to have my breasts removed through double mastectomy. I want hormones that are going to suppress my puberty, and then other hormones that will be testosterone. Again, I'm talking girls to boys. And anyway, so they're demanding radical, unproven interventions to make huge, but potentially life-changing and sometimes life-ruining alterations to their body. And this is very different from let's say, a 5-year-old boy who is extremely effeminate, who, if you just watched him play for an hour and engage in everything like that, if you let him grow out his hair, you might go, that actually might be a little girl. Like from the youngest of ages, whether he shows distress over this or not, the fact is he presents very differently from these teenagers who are, again, biological girls, or from another category, one whole totally different category we'll talk about afterward as well, where a boy who's stereotypically a boy at a young age, as a teenager, he's stereotypically a teenager. He plays a teenage boy, sorry. He plays sports. He has girlfriends. He's a jock. He's masculine. And then during puberty, he develops a paraphilia, or what some people call a fetish or a kink, that is sexually connected. That's very different from a young boy who's not acting this way through sexual feelings, or through girls who suddenly believe that there are boys. Again, what I'm saying is there's so many different phenomena here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason that people don't want to talk about it is that they believe that somehow this is going to negate or deny the trans experience. And I'm hoping that when people watch us talk about this, they're going to hear us saying, no, no. All we're saying is different people, different pathways, and like toward feeling this way.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need different solutions to helping them cope with these experiences that they're having.
Right.
That can be so distressing that they feel that the only, that some people claim that suicide, it's either suicide or transition. So if we're going to say something that extreme, we better know what we're talking about.
Yeah. And to summarize what you said there, we're talking about multiple different things, right? So again, there is the clinically diagnosed gender dysphoria, and then there are many other pieces of the puzzle, many of which, and this is controversial, are socially constructed. So for example, the social contagion of, rapid onset gender dysphoria, meaning, teens are being exposed to a lot of different pieces of media, conversations with friends, and so on and so forth. And this is not to deny their experience by any means, but that is not necessarily clinically diagnosable gender dysphoria. So I want to talk a little bit more about Littman's research, and there's two pieces of research. One of them was survey research of the parents of individuals who transitioned. And that got a lot of flack. So she did a follow-up study, which actually was interviewing individuals who detransitioned. So I'm going to rattle off some interesting statistics here that I have noted down. And again, as you said, Oren, her research came into a lot of scrutiny, and she originally was doing this research with Brown University and is no longer there. There isn't really clear information as to why not, but it is surmised that it has a lot to do with the controversy of her research. So let me see here. So this is an interesting one that I want to start with. So 62.5% of individuals in the first study who were expressing gender dysphoria also met the criteria for another mental health disorder and or a neurodevelopmental disorder before they began feeling gender dysphoric. So this is really controversial because a lot of the arguments surrounding specifically the development of things like anxiety and depression, the argument is, well, because they are gender dysphoric, therefore they feel ostracized and, as social outcasts, so on and so forth, and that develops into depressed mood and anxious distress. But that argument doesn't stand when it comes to neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, such as autism, because as we know, that is something that people are born with. So the next thing that I want to discuss here is, how much of this rapid onset gender dysphoria is really more about personality, variance in personality traits, variance in identity, not gender identity, but identity as a whole, that are either influenced by psychiatric psychological disorders or just who these people are in general. And it has nothing to do with gender per se.
Right. Now, just one thing. So if people look up Lisa Littman, if you look at PLOS ONE, where the study was published, where you pay to publish, you will see something very different than what is claimed online by many people trying to dismiss her study. So because people say that her study was taken down, Brown dissociated themselves from her. They didn't want to be connected to her. And so I just want to give a quick background before we continue about what ROGD is, because if people are exposed to something that either makes them feel uncomfortable or goes against what they want to believe, their cognitive dissonance is going to cause them to want to see things differently from how reality really is. They don't want to accept it. So I just want to say very quickly, if you just Google Lisa Littman, Dr. Lisa Littman, ROGD study, you will see literally millions of hits where people are claiming that it was totally discredited. Brown doesn't want anything to do with her. Plus One took it down. Well, they did take it down because they got so much flack. They did a very thorough review again, and there were minor changes in the wording of like there were more caveats. She had to be more clear in explaining that it was recruiting the parents only, not
Yeah.
the actual children, and discussing the limitations, being a bit more upfront about it. But that's it. The findings themselves
Hmm.
were not disputed.
No, no.
So it's still a credible study. And yes, it would have been nice to have spoken to those people themselves, which she did subsequently, not the same people, but spoke to other people
Yeah.
who had ROGD. But and by the way, just this is why I am so intent on discussing this publicly, because a few years ago, I have to be careful because of confidentiality, but a colleague in a different country almost lost their license. They were threatened with losing their license, and it's not just one person; there are a few people. Okay, but I remember the first case where they were threatened with losing their license if they continued to use the term ROGD.
Mm,
It was considered hateful. Who declares it to be hateful?
yeah.
Just because something can be used hatefully doesn't make it a hateful construct
Well, and
or
to
term
touch back
or
on what
her
you said
intention.
earlier, when people, unfortunately, when people hear what they don't want to hear, we've talked
Right.
about this in a previous episode about, the words becoming violence. Essentially, it's thrown back of, well, that's hateful because that's not what I want to hear.
Right. And it's so hateful that it's going to cause people's death.
Hmm.
And that's not the case.
No.
It's again, she used a term to describe a phenomenon that she and many others had observed. And I'm glad that she did that. But so again, it's not technically a term yet, but people just they're trying to discredit the term. They're trying to discredit her. And throughout our discussions about this, we're going to talk about other people who've been totally discredited, or at least there's been attempts to discredit them. And it's got to the point that all you have to say is what Littman or what,
Mm,
and a whole bunch of other names, and they're looking at you as if either how did you not know that they were complete quacks? In the same way they're saying, how do you not know that the Earth is round? Or what? You're listening to those people?
yeah.
Why don't you just listen to Hitler? Okay, like this is the kind of antipathy that is directed toward them in their work, just because people are so afraid
Hmm.
of, again, this evidence and these claims that go against what they want to believe. So I really want to emphasize that so that people can do their own due diligence,
Yes.
read the links that we're going to send,
Yeah.
and to understand that there's so much bad press against them that is just not warranted.
And for folks
So
to
I
go
forget
in
the
with
original
as
question.
critical an eye as possible, right? Because yeah, we can't go into reading any research, whether it's on this topic or anything else, with our own biases, because that is absolutely going to color what we see and how we see it.
Exactly. And when the experts themselves are threatened with extreme sanctions like losing your license,
Yeah.
well, that's going to make people back off and they're not going to do their due diligence. They're going to say, well, I've been told I must see things this way. I must do things this way. I'm afraid to do anything otherwise. And then if they start to look into this other information, now they're stuck with this moral conscience or this crisis of conscience
Hmm.
because they're saying, wait a second, there's all this evidence that's saying that maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. How can somebody dedicating their professional lives to helping others, how can they live with the fact that they might be doing more harm than good? That's terrifying. So they're not even looking at that other information. They would rather just say, "Oh yeah, they've been discredited. They're quacks." So that's why I'm saying at the front, at the very beginning, I want to really emphasize
Yeah.
that please go beyond the headlines, go beyond the social media posts, and actually look at the work that these people have done that we're going to be talking about throughout this whole discussion. Okay, and so I mean, again, I've lost the original question. Okay, but we're talking about rapid onset gender dysphoria.
And specifically, I
Um,
think what I was asking was surrounding the idea of personality and these variances
right.
in identity that have nothing specifically to do with gender per se.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So depending on the study you look at, and Bailey and Diaz, or Diaz and Bailey, Suzanne Diaz is a pseudonym. I actually had her on my podcast a few years ago, discussing her before she had actually published it with Dr. or Michael Bailey this year. They did a follow up, or she did a follow up, and then Bailey came in to help on more parents. So the similar methodology to Dr. Littman's. Now, I'm going to be clear here. The parents were recruited from websites run by parents who are very concerned about this phenomenon. And the wording of the survey, like to get people in, it was biased. It was basically telling people, like, if you have a problem with this, if your children are struggling and so on, um, come do the study. Now, if it was simply, if children are struggling, that's not an issue. But the language was, inflammatory, let's say, because these parents are really concerned about what they were seeing. It was affecting them. This was not some abstract construct. It wasn't some esoteric thought experiment. It was real parents watching their children deteriorate, watching their children leave the family, watching the children become somebody they don't recognize and just become mentally unwell. Again, the deterioration was significant, and making demands that the parents knew were not in the kid's best interest or believed were not in the kid's best interest. Because again, these kids were suddenly saying things that seemed to have nothing to do with their historic experiences. So the point is, yes, it's a biased sample, but if you look at all the research on these issues, very rarely will you not see extreme bias in the sampling, in the methodologies, in the conclusions that are drawn. This cuts across all research. It's not just one study. So what the Diaz and Bailey study found, and what Lisa Litton found, and what other people have argued, is that, at least in the Bailey and Diaz study, 6%, and I was surprised, only 6% of the adolescents had been diagnosed with autism. Now, because they're relatively young and because they're mostly females, we know, anyone who knows anything about autism knows that the diagnosis for females is often missed.
Mm-hmm.
They are diagnosed with other, let's say, disorders, not autism. It's not usually till later on in life that they realize, wait a second, whether borderline personality disorder or some other type of phenomenon, it doesn't really describe me as well as this other diagnosis of autism. So even though it said 6%, first of all, that's much higher than the general public. Okay, it's like about 5 or 6 times higher. And second, again, I would argue that many of these younger people will be diagnosed with autism later on. So that's just one of them. And the depression, anxiety, all these other disorders, yes, as you said, it could be. Someone could argue that maybe it's a result of what they were struggling with, whether internally or socially. I get that. But there was also ADHD, OCD, trauma, lots of trauma.
Yeah.
And the trauma was not related to gender. It was sexual, oftentimes it was sexual abuse or other types of trauma. So the fact is, many of these young people have, whether it's personality or psychiatric condition or psychological condition, they had issues that were not necessarily related to gender per se.
Mm-hmm.
But they were related to their difficulty in either feeling comfortable in themselves as a human being, in their identity, and how they related socially to other people, interpersonally. They didn't fit in. So if you're told as a 12 or 14 or 16-year-old that, oh, by the way, the reason you feel so uncomfortable, the reason puberty was so difficult, which who is it not difficult for, especially for females, the reason that you don't feel like you belong to everyone else is gender dysphoria, or
Yeah.
you are
Yeah.
transgender.
I want to pause you there
If
because
they
one
are,
of the really
yeah,
controversial things right now is that not only we as clinicians, but the general population, it is completely hands off to say that, perhaps this general dysphoria or distress has to do with a previous trauma. That's become a like, no, how dare you make such an accusation? This person is transgender, they're in the wrong body, et cetera, et cetera. How dare you say that?
right. And when asexuality, so with people with zero libido, I'm going to sound like I'm shifting gears, but it's very related. At first, when this became kind of popularized by Tony Bogart, he's not the first person, but Dr. Tony Bogart from Brock University, he did publish a study over 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, talking about this. And he's written about it since. At first, they were saying, look, this is just how we're born. There's no trauma. We're just born without libido. Okay. And to, if this took the same pathway as it's doing with gender related issues, then if anyone were to say, well, maybe sometimes there could be trauma, maybe that the person, it was too young to remember, or that they've repressed. If you were to say that, they would say, no, you can't, that's wrong. That's hateful. It's terrible. No, they're just asexual. They're born that way. But with further research, where you are seeing that, yes, many people who now say that they are asexual did have a history of trauma, often related to their sexuality. So it could have been sexual assault. It could have been related to their sexuality. Maybe they tried to come out as gay and they were shunned or beaten. Something terrible happened. So they inhibited their sexual feelings. So again, all we're trying to do is we're saying we need to look at all of these different possible causal factors. We need to look at all these correlated factors and try to see what is the best way to help people deal with, again, these internal or social/interpersonal issues. That's all we're trying to do. And
Yeah.
we can't do it if we're not allowed to have discussions.
Right. Yeah. And the social contagion aspect of it is another
Right.
controversial piece of the puzzle. And, we've seen this before with other disorders. I know back in my adolescence, anorexia and bulimia, that was one of the, similar phenomena that we were seeing. Um, I want to draw an analogy, though, to the current social contagion aspect of rapid onset gender dysphoria and what we're actually seeing in the clinic in terms of, I'll say specifically with ADHD. So there's a lot out there right now. TikTok, put a finger down if you have X, Y, and Z symptoms. Oh, you must have ADHD. And we're actually seeing a lot of younger individuals come in for an information session because they are convinced that they have ADHD. But there's this aspect of confirmation bias that people are ignoring that, we can put ourselves into any box if we know the general symptoms. But if it's not being looked at with a thorough evaluation and a trained clinical eye, then we've got a real problem. And what we're often finding is that, not to discredit what these folks are experiencing, but oftentimes it's not ADHD, it's trauma, it is anxiety, it is, any number of different disorders that has overlap in symptoms with ADHD. So I draw this analogy because, I think that that's a little bit less controversial of an example to use, but the same principle can be applied to, again, the social contagion associated with rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Right. And by saying all of this, nobody would say that you're denying the existence of
No,
ADHD.
no,
You're
it's one of
just
our
saying
areas of
that you need
expertise,
to be
right? We totally believe in it.
right. And then there's the ADHD that seems, that people seem to be born with a neurodivergence. And then there's people who seem to meet all the criteria for ADHD. But if you look at it, it's really a reaction to parenting style or, poor coping and so on. So, we wouldn't consider that the same in the sense of it's not neurological, it's more environmental, right? We're trying to delineate between these different factors.
Yeah.
So we need to do the same with, again, gender related issues and to deny the fact, as you just said, that if someone is exposed every single day on TikTok or other social media to these claims of, A, this is who I am and this is who you may be. B, by being this way, by being your authentic self, you're going to have this amazing life. Everything you're experiencing now, all this social isolation, all the feelings of confusion or
Yeah.
distress, whatever, it's all going to go away magically.
Yeah.
When someone sees this from the age of 8 or 10 or 12 or younger, they don't have the wherewithal to say, well, wait a second, maybe I'm being sold a bill of goods that's not going to deliver, right? They don't have that ability to say that. So all they're looking at is this is the solution. This is the solution.
Right.
And again, anyone to deny the effects of social contagion is denying reality. As you said, eating disorders, body image issues. Even now, we've seen this whole rise of tics, verbal
Yes. Yeah.
oh my gosh, Tourette's
Yeah.
disorder.
Yeah.
People claiming this, right? This is happening, and once again, it doesn't mean that everybody who's now presenting to clinics saying I have, gender dysphoria, or I am trans, or I'm non-binary. We're not saying that this applies to everybody.
Hmm.
We're saying we need to know how many it applies to. We need to know how to help those people
Right.
because the solution being proposed for those people is
Yeah.
100% wrong.
Right. And it in
And it's going
fact means
to
that
literally ruin their lives.
we have to do a better job of evaluating and assessing. And unfortunately the guidance being given is quite the opposite as far as, we have to affirm. And it I don't know what other way to put it, but it makes my brain hurt because it is our job to be as thorough as we can when we're investigating anything.
Right. And that's the ethical guidelines that we must follow, moral and ethical. And here's the thing, Bill C4, it was called Bill C16, then Bill C6, now it's Bill C4 in Canada. This was a nightmare. It's worded better now. I just want people to understand this because it might sound like we're throwing things random or I'm throwing things randomly, but they're all going to tie together. I want people to understand that if you're coming from it as a parent or as the individual who has these feelings or as a clinician trying to help these people or as an educator, we are being hamstrung. We're being prevented from taking that thorough approach that you mentioned. So Bill C4 makes it illegal for to conduct conversion therapy in Canada. It's not just going to lose your license. You can risk going to jail, whether it's you're trying to transition someone's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And they conflated it. And we're going to talk about several conflations today. And I'm going to talk about the first one, which is conversion therapy for again for sexual orientation versus gender. When the bill was first proposed, the wording was so terrible, it was so ambiguous that asking any questions whatsoever. So literally, if a kid came in, let's say a 5-year-old child came in and said, let's say it's a boy, and they said, I'm a girl. The way it was worded, if a clinician said, so why do you think so? Or let's explore that.
Which is a
could
normal line
have
of
been
questioning in our
arrested.
job, by the way.
Which is a normal line of questioning. Exactly. So doctors Kenneth Zucker and James Cantor went before the Senate. I think it was January, February, and it was either 2018 or 2019. Again, I always apologize for the years. But they went there and they argued passionately saying the wording is terrible. We need to change it. So they did change it. And it says explicitly in Bill C4, because again, people are being too hyperbolic. I want people to know the truth behind the bill. The law says that if you simply ask questions, just explore without bias, that's not going to be considered conversion therapy. So now if a child comes in, they're 5 years old, and the boy says, I'm a girl, you say, well, why do you think so? That would not be considered. However, here's the problem. The wording states, as long as they're not showing a preference for a quote unquote cisgender identity. So the cisgender believe it or not, I ask this at my class all the time at Toronto at TMU, a very progressive university, and not everybody knows. So cisgender is it came out in I think 1996 or 7. The term was used to describe somebody whose sense of gender matches their biological sex. I am a man. I am biologically a male. I feel like a male. I am cisgender. Okay. Whereas transgender would be the opposite. And by the way, a little side note here, I understand why they would use that term. I don't like the politics behind it.
Likewise.
I refuse to play into political games and the ideology. But if someone said, either you're trans or, well, the alternative would be normal. And if you say that, cis people are normal, and I'm using the term, I don't use the term cis, but let's say non-trans people are normal, that means trans people are abnormal. So I understand why they wanted to come up with a complementary term for transgender, cisgender. They want to destigmatize, depathologize. I get it. I won't use it because of the politics, but I understand why they're using it. So people understand that term. So getting back to now I forgot again. I'm sorry. There's so much stuff that we have to continue.
So you're talking about Bill C4.
Thank you. Okay. And if people don't know, I tell this to all my students. After I had my open heart surgery a few years ago, the ability to stay on focus sometimes it's much trickier. So for myself, because after the surgery, so I apologize if I get derailed. So thanks, Malini. So Bill C4, okay, it's supposed to allow the clinician to explore without bias, and the bias can only be in the direction. It says in the bill, if a cisgender or a heterosexual identity. So if a therapist, and we've seen many cases, I've had so many people around the world, including in Canada, States, and elsewhere, write to me and tell me or reach out to me and say, my child came in. And by the way, whether the child or the person themselves, I've had both cases. All right. So I'm going to use the first person account where someone comes in, they told me they came in and they were saying, look, I'm having this, I'm during puberty, I felt really uncomfortable. And this was a female. Okay. And I think I'm into girls and I'm feeling, I'm confused. I'm lost. And she said that the therapist, like really quickly is like, saying, you must be trans, something along those lines. Okay. Now I wasn't there. I'm just hearing what she recounted. Okay. But why would we deny her lived experience? If that's what she says happened, why wouldn't we believe her? Okay. And she was saying, and she was surprised because the therapist kept seeming to push for this, this trans answer. And she's like, maybe there's other issues. And she was trying to say, I've had trauma. I was assaulted, when I was younger. I always had, I felt uncomfortable around my body after that. And she was trying to say that. And she said that the therapist kept trying to push. And she also said that the therapist, I'm not going to be too specific. Let's just say that the therapist had a very personal reason to believe that being trans was the answer. So
Which
I'm going to
again,
say,
like any other disorder, that is so antithetical to what we are supposed to be doing. We can't do that in our profession. I don't care if it's trans
right,
issues, PTSD, ADHD. We can't just say, "Oh, you look like you have this disorder." That's not how it works.
exactly, right. But that's what they're saying is happening.
It
And
is,
again,
and it is.
that would be fine. It
Yeah.
is happening, and that according to Bill C4, that would be fine because they weren't promoting a cisgender, pathway. So here's the problem: if someone is completely neutral and they have not tried to, persuade the person one way or the other, they're just exploring without any bias whatsoever. If the patient subsequently doesn't like, let's say, what's happening, if the patient maybe has certain personality features that make them more prone to misinterpreting or
Yeah.
to being hostile and going after people they don't, that they think have wronged them, then if they made a claim
Hmm.
saying that my therapist was biased, etc., how does the therapist
Yes.
prove
Yeah.
to the licensing agency or board that what they did was not biased,
Yeah.
was ethical, and so on? And unless they've recorded all their sessions, right, and shown exactly, and even then, even if there was an audio recording, they have to show the visual because the patient can say, well, their words were this,
But
but
their
their
body
eyes
language
said
was
that.
such that, yeah,
The
yeah,
body thing,
yeah,
right? Okay, so everyone that I've spoken to, including myself, is terrified to deal with these issues because they don't, sorry, let me rephrase that. Everyone who wants to be ethical,
yes,
who wants to come in completely without a preset notion of what this issue is, they're terrified. People who've been promoting gender ideology for years, they have no fears because, not again, the bill does not apply to them.
no, no,
So, and it's so ironic when you think about it. When we talk about conversion therapy, if someone is trying to say to people who aren't transgender, yes, you are transgender, that's literally the definition of conversion,
right,
right? They're trying to convert their identity, their body, yet that's not considered an issue. That's not conversion therapy.
yeah,
So that's Bill C4 in Canada. It passed. It's not just, again, it's not just a licensing issue. Now it's a legal issue. So not only would you have to then face your board, your licensing board, you would also, or college, you would also have to face the law potentially,
yeah,
right? Just for trying to help people. So and so what's happening is so many people are backing off, and now all these younger people are going toward one stream. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who's on that in that stream is unethically or incompetently pushing people into that. I'm not saying that, but there are many anecdotal accounts of them being either pushed or not having enough due diligence, getting hormones prescribed on the very first session after speaking to the therapist for an hour. And people say that never happens. There are so many accounts, sometimes
yeah,
recorded
yeah,
accounts of people getting that in Canada, in the States, in the
hmm
UK. So pretend it's not happening would be to deny reality.
yeah. So I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, the falsehood of, well, if I transition, then I'm going to feel better. It's going to solve all my problems. And the fallacy with that in terms of, from a clinical perspective, we know that typically there's more to the story that's not being addressed. And this one factor isn't going to fix anything or everything, I should say, pardon me. But I want to go back to the Littman study as far as what she specifically found in her second study. So with
Right.
respect to the fact that some of these children that transition thought that transitioning would make all of their distress go away, but in fact, what her study found was that 61% returned to identifying as their birth sex, 14% ended up identifying as non-binary, and 8% continued to identify as trans. So the detransitioners have often been ostracized from their community. So this causes some secondary problems as well that nobody's talking about.
And this is, I'm telling you right now, I've said this many times. It's a tragedy because the people who say that I am the most compassionate, I am the most tolerant, and I demand that you be compassionate and tolerant
Yeah.
too, oftentimes they are the least compassionate or
Yeah.
tolerant. You want to know how we know this? Look at how they talk about the detransitioners, the amount of hate, the
Yeah.
vitriol, just the slander and defamation and libel laid against these people. It's horrific. So what they're saying is, well, they were never really trans in the first place.
Hmm.
Well, we'll talk about the statistics later on, but there are many people for whom we could say the same thing, which is they were never trans in the first place. So why are we pushing to transition them when that's not the best answer?
Right.
So it's heartbreaking because the people who are detransitioning, they've already had either hormonal or surgical procedures that have, again, affected their functioning. You can hear the distress in their voice, the regret. And I've watched so many videos and I've spoken to so many people who've gone through this, and it's heartbreaking. And so to anyone to try to minimize that, to try to sweep them under the carpet because it goes against the narrative, that's the opposite of compassionate, tolerant, ethical, humane. Okay. So yeah, it's the other thing is this: even if they haven't medically transitioned, they've already joined groups, whether it's online or at their school or something like that, where they're part of that group. They're
Right.
part of that family through their gender identity.
Right. And I
And
want
they've
to
now
focus
find
on
it.
identity, right? Because being part of a group is
Right,
such an important part of our identity. So is it
right.
the gender issue, or is it the lack of relationships and the lack of belonging that's contributing to a lot of that distress?
Exactly. And it is when you speak to people, it clearly is.
Yeah.
Again, many of them felt like social misfits. So now they do have that group. And when you're transitioning from childhood into early adolescence, that's such an important
Hmm.
transition in our lives, not just for puberty, but again for social in our social contacts.
Hmm.
And at all ages, 90s, the high 90% of people, because we're social animals, we need to feel a sense of belonging. And if we don't, and you've talked about neurodiversity, like with ADHD or autism, people with addictions, one of the worst things a person can feel is like the other, excluded, not part of the group, different from, other than. And we've talked about this before. And this is what they feel. So if they're given a solution, again, even if there's no medical transitioning involved, it's just taking on this identity that feels right in the moment, and they're being validated, they're being glorified for it, and they're being accepted for it. So when you have that, to suddenly say, everyone, I think I made a mistake,
Hmm.
that's extremely hard, even for smaller issues, for people to accept. For something like this, your core sense of being, at least that's what it feels like when you spend all your time talking about your gender.
Yeah.
It does become the be all end all, right? To suddenly go, I was wrong, and sorry everyone, I've got to leave you. Okay, they can't do that, so they're struggling. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to throw again. It sounds like I'm going off on these tangents, but I see the same issues when I deal with children whose parents are going through divorce,
Hmm.
this sense of loyalty, torn loyalties. Okay. I want to do right by mommy. I want to do right by daddy. Okay. And they're fighting. I'm feeling torn. Okay. It's the same thing. But in this case, it's I want to do right by myself and I want to do right by my group.
Right.
And how do I reconcile that? They're betraying one or the other. And it is causing and exacerbating confusion and distress.
We hope that you found this discussion thought provoking so far. Join us next week to hear part two on Awake at the Wheel.